island from another time. A true wildlife wonderland. But Cuba is now opening her doors to the outside world. Will the island's wildlife pay the ultimate price?
Wednesday at 8 on WTTW.
Writing binds humanity together practically more than any other activity.
Follow the history of the written word.
Wow. Writing always starts with pictures.
And discover where A to Z got its start. The first alphabet on Nova. Wednesday at 9 on WTTW.
What treasures will you find in the 2022 WTTW Great Treasure Hunt Sweepstakes? Enter now for your chance to win the bonus prize, a $10,000 home furnishing makeover from Walter E. Smith. Your home makeover will include expert design services and custom furnishings, all tailored to fit your style. Transform your living room, bedroom, or dining space with the experts at Walter E. Smith. Enter now at WTTW.com/sweepstakes for your chance to win.
WTTW programming originates from the Renee Crown Public Media Center.
Next time on Midsummer Murders.
Victim is professional cyclist Greg Eden.
When the winner of a race is killed, the cause of death is a surprise.
He was poisoned.
Barnaby wonders if the motive was winning.
What about rivalries? It's a competitive sport. There's always going to be rivalry.
And he has a lot of suspects.
The list of text messages he received, including, "I'm going to get you for this."
It's a race for answers on Midsummer Murders.
Thursday at 8 on WTTW.
It's my fault. I needed you. Knowing the truth and getting justice isn't the same thing.
My boy is in there!
You are charged with murder contrary to common law. How do you plead? Guilty or not guilty?
Thursday at 9 on WTTW.
Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Amanda Vinicky. Brandis Friedman is on assignment. On the show tonight,
it's just reached really a fever pitch.
Following yet another chaotic weekend of drag racing, what some local older people would like to see done about it.
Plus details into new initiatives that address traffic fatalities in the city.
CPS students are back in school, so what can teachers and families expect? One-on-one with the head of the Chicago Teachers Union.
Protesters camp out in an Uptown parking lot to try and block a new luxury condo development.
We are fully prepared to continue with further direct action.
Workers at a unionized Starbucks in Edgewater go on strike over claims that management is retaliating against workers.
We had 20 missiles and 20 warheads.
Chicago was once home to nearly 24 Nike missile bases. What the sites look like today in Ask Jeffrey.
And movie history and graphic art come together in a colossal collection of movie posters and lobby cards from Hollywood's golden age. But first, some of today's top stories. A new policy guarantees Chicago police officers at least one day off every week and a minimum of 9 hours of rest between shifts. That's unless the holiday requires additional police power. Police Superintendent David Brown said in a statement, "While our officers work to safeguard this city, we must also put safeguards in place to protect our officers. The health and well-being of our officers is a top priority, and we have taken steps to ensure they have time to rest and re-energize." Brown's announcement follows an analysis that found more than 1,000 officers were scheduled to work 11 or more consecutive days between April and May 31st this past year. Since 2018, 10 officers have died by suicide, including 3 in July. Alderman Tom Tunney of the 44th Ward will not run for re-election. Tunney's the first openly gay person to serve on the Chicago City Council. He currently leads the zoning committee. He was elected nearly 20 years ago in 2003 to represent Lakeview and Wrigleyville. I will continue to work tirelessly for the ward through my last day on the City Council. As I look ahead, I see so many great ways in which I can continue to give back to the city I love, Tunney said in a statement. The announcement means there will be an open contest for the 44th Ward in the February municipal election. Tunney right away endorsed his chief of staff, Bennett Lawson. Prosecutors rest their case in the federal child pornography trial of Chicago-born R&B singer R. Kelly. Included in the nearly 2 weeks of evidence and testimony, more than 20 government witnesses, including 4 women who say they were sexually abused by Kelly. Some were as young as 14 years old, well under the legal age of consent in Illinois. The defense will begin presenting its case on Thursday. Closing arguments are expected next week. Up next, the head of the Chicago Teachers Union on tackling new changes this school year. Stay with us.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
School's about a week and a half into session, and CPS students have seen some changes around campus and in their classrooms. Also different this year, COVID protocols, which no longer require someone to quarantine if they have had an exposure. So after 2+ years of work stoppages and labor disputes, will students finally get to enjoy a fully uninterrupted school year? Here to talk about some of the changes teachers and students can expect is the new president of the Chicago Teachers Union, Stacey Davis Gates. Stacey Davis Gates, welcome back, as always, to Chicago Tonight. So that first question, it's been a rough few years, COVID, work stoppages. Will this be a full school year of labor peace and kids in the classroom?
Well, I think the question is, will we have the types of mitigations that we need to keep people safe in our school communities, Paris? The work stoppages were because of COVID, because there needed to be mitigations in place, not because of just work stoppages. That said, COVID is a little different because we have a vaccine available. And keeping schools open means that the district should figure out how to work with us to get our students vaccinated again. The overwhelming majority of students that we serve at the Chicago Public Schools are not vaccinated. There is a slow uptake on it with their families. Just this week, we have about 600 of our school community members, students and adults included, that have self-reported the COVID, that they have contracted COVID. That is without the mask. Also, at the end of last week, the labor board said that the Chicago Teachers Union was right about, the district having to negotiate with us about masking, and that the district and the mayor got that wrong. And so what I will say, Paris, is that it's been quite the journey. COVID has been friendly to no one. And I'm very proud of our members for ensuring that our school communities can be as safe as they are currently. And we still have a ways to go.
You bring up that the judge basically ruled in your favor that the city was supposed to negotiate in getting that mask mandate taken away. They didn't negotiate that with you in good faith. So the CPS is basically following the CDC guidelines right now, which are more relaxed than they have been. Are you okay with that?
Well, ask the 600 people whose lives have been interrupted with COVID, over the past week, how they're feeling about that. Look, masking is a mitigation that doesn't take a lot. My children still wear their masks to school. It is a requirement from my household. And I think that is something that helps keep us all safe.
But is there a safety agreement in place between CTU and CPS for this year, as has been reported? Because it sounds like there might be some things that you're not in agreement on.
No, what you're hearing is that COVID is not in agreement with stability. COVID is not in agreement with good health. Our safety agreement that we concluded with Pedro and his team says very clearly that we have a safety net, meaning that testing is supposed to happen, meaning that we still have school-wide safety committees, meaning meaning that we still have a district-wide safety committee, that we have a safety net to catch us if things go in the wrong direction.
All right, well, let's talk about another issue facing teachers and schools across the country, a teacher shortage. Pedro Martinez says CPS has most of its teacher positions filled, but they're about 900 short on staff members. What does CTU plan to do to try and accelerate the hiring of some of those positions?
Well, again, the two words that I'm going to use is partnership and with. We don't keep teachers inside of our schools if we don't teach them well. The labor unrest that you detailed earlier was about the inhumanity of the plans that were put forth in the first place. The burden that our teachers and our paraprofessionals and our clinicians have to shoulder because we're not working with or in partnership with the people who also get to make decisions. We've had to force our way. So the first thing that I would say is that you got to respect the people doing the work because they know what they're talking about. And then you also have to provide the necessary funding. Again, the state of Illinois is sending funding to Chicago. Our district, with our mayor's funding formula, it sends less money to the schools that need the most. So we got to figure that out. That burns people out. It's tough being in the classroom when you don't have what you need.
Are you saying there are candidates to fill these positions and CPS just needs to hire them, or are there not enough folks in the pipeline to get these positions?
I think it's dimensional. I think one thing is that our pipeline has been interrupted. We need to get more Black teachers, more brown teachers in the pipeline. And that's going to take some collaboration from teacher education programs and zeroing in on the actual expertise that they need to have in the classroom. That's one thing. I think the second thing is what I elaborated on initially. You got to treat people well once they become a part of the school community. And I think the third thing is that there has to be a partnership in how you create policy. The policies that work inside the school community are policies that are created and implemented with the people, not against them and not in spite of them.
And related to this, Stacey, 10 years ago the school closings were highly controversial, but even right now there are many under-enrolled schools, and a recent report from Chalk Beach showed that it costs much more per student to educate per student at an under-enrolled school. Pedro Martinez has hinted at some plans to rethink some of these schools. What do you think should be done? What should CPS's plan be for these under-enrolled schools?
The first thing is that I don't know what under-enrolled means. We have to define under-enrolled. Does that mean that Black children on the South Side or the West Side get a smaller class size? Because if that's what under-enrolled is, perhaps we need to interrogate that more and offer those smaller class sizes. Does it mean that when you have under-enrolled schools that you have less students there, but they may have more needs? And so you could create a school day that responds to the needs of the students that are there. For instance, our special education program in the Chicago Public Schools now is upside down. Is there a way, because we know that the vast majority of our special education students are Black students who go to schools on the South Side and the West Side of the city, can we figure out how to offer something to our special education students in places that are, quote, under-enrolled that we may not be able to do in other places? The reimagination of this has got to be with us. Listen, there are a lot of things that we know. The issue that we've had is that they don't want to listen to us until we're on the picket line. What we are asking for in this era of leadership is an opportunity to sit at a table and to partner and to create the types of policies and infrastructure that will grow our district, that will meet the needs of the families that already choose our district, and to provide a base level of support in all of our school communities, especially the ones that have been victimized by the underfunding over generations.
All right, we only have a few seconds left, but I want to ask you a political question. You're not running for mayor. Cook County Commissioner Brandon Johnson, who was formerly with the CTU, is considering it. Is Brandon Johnson the CTU-backed candidate for mayor?
So a couple of things. Brandon Johnson should consider it. Brandon Johnson leaves his community of Austin every single day to drop children off to school on the Northwest Side and on the South Side of Chicago. He knows the struggle of Chicago public school parents. And beyond that, look, we need partnership. We want to work in collaboration to make the Chicago Public Schools the shining star of public education in this country. And the only way that we're going to be able to do that is with a leader who is invested because he has family, because he is living in the communities that need it the most.
All right. Our thanks to Stacey Davis Gates for joining us as always. Thanks so much.
Hey, thank you, Paris.
And now to Amanda for a look at the alarming rate of traffic deaths in Chicago. Amanda.
Paris, nearly 24 organizations are asking the Illinois Department of Transportation and Governor J.B. Pritzker to use funds from the bipartisan infrastructure federal law to improve safe and accessible transportation for everyone. According to city data, so far this year, there have been 31 pedestrian and bicyclist deaths in Chicago, more than 1,800 injuries, and of those injuries, 390 pedestrians and bicyclists were left incapacitated. Initiatives led by local organizations and Chicago officials aim to improve traffic safety, but what more can be done? Joining us are Amy Reinell, Executive Director of the Active Transportation Alliance. It's one of the organizations that did sign on to that letter. Also, David Smith, the Bicycle and Pedestrian Program Manager at the Chicago Department of Transportation. So, Amy, let's begin with you. Illinois is hoping to get a lot of money from that federal law, and in this letter asking the governor and IDOT to use some of the money for reasons like making roads safer for vulnerable users. What in a practical way does that mean?
Our roadways are designed to facilitate speed, to move cars from A to B as quickly as possible. And that is in conflict with people who walk to get around places, with buses, and with cyclists. So it makes our roads a lot more dangerous for people who aren't inside a multi-ton vehicle. So there are opportunities at the state level to change policy and priorities around making our streets safer. And many of those streets that we're talking about fall within the city limits.
Can you give me one example, Amy, of what you could do to a street to make it safer for a vulnerable road user, a pedestrian, a bicyclist?
Sure, the more lanes there is to cross, the more unsafe it is. So we have a lot of 4-lane, 5-lane, 6-lane, in some cases, streets. And to make those safer for everyone involved and to slow cars down, we need to reduce some of those traffic lanes and build in other things that make people drive slower and make crossing safer. Things like raised crosswalks, shorter distances for crossing, protected bike lanes, and other things.
David, let's go to you because sort of mixed in with this, CDOT is 5 years now into Vision Zero Chicago, and that is a traffic safety plan that aims to really do just what it says, and that is eliminate fatalities and serious injuries, that is, from traffic crashes, literally down to zero. Now, obviously, that would be wonderful. Is it realistic?
Well, Amanda, at the City of Chicago, we are committed to making sure that everybody can move around our city, move around our streets safely and comfortably, regardless of your age, whether you're a child or a senior citizen, no matter your mode of transportation, whether you're walking, biking, getting to public transit, or driving, and regardless of your ability. So whether you're a perfectly able-bodied individual or if you're in a walker or a wheelchair pushing a stroller, everybody deserves to be able to get around our city safely and comfortably. And we really are committed to that as a department and as a city.
So David, yeah, go ahead. I was going to ask, what are some of the program successes so far in trying to achieve that goal?
So we've had some really exciting work happen over the last several years. A big part of that has been thanks to a local funding source called Chicago Works, which was implemented under Mayor Lori Lightfoot. It's provided over $20 million of annual money for complete streets projects. And so with that funds, we've been implementing more infrastructure for vulnerable roadway users, people walking and biking, than ever before. Protected bike lanes, as Amy mentioned, neighborhood greenways, pedestrian improvements all throughout the city. We've been engaging with communities in new and different and exciting ways that we haven't done in years past. And we've been offering some really exciting programs to encourage people to get out of their car. For example, we've been really expanding a program called Learn to Ride, where we've been teaching adults and kids how to ride a bike. We've had over 70 of these events already this year. And as you probably know and have heard, we'll be giving away 5,000 bicycles over the coming years to Chicagoans.
Even if you don't forget how to ride a bike, sometimes it can feel a little shaky if it's been a while. Now, Amy, unfortunately, as we heard some statistics just at the top here, not just in Chicago and Illinois, but nationally, there's a lot of data about things really going in the opposite direction of safety, with increases in speeding, more crashes. What's behind that trend? What do you make of it?
People are writing books about this, but I think at the most basic, I think the street design really came out of highway design, and that's for fast travel, and our city streets aren't appropriate for that. So I think more people are out walking and biking and getting around in ways. Our city is really multimodal. Before the pandemic, only about 60% of us got around regularly via car. So as more people transition to especially short trips, 1 mile or less, 3 miles or less, to get their child to school, pick up some groceries, walk to the library, etc., there's no need to get in a car for that. And so our infrastructure isn't built to support that in all the ways that it should. How do we share our space in new ways? So there are some really positive things happening, but there's also a lot more speeding, and it just feels really dangerous out there.
You know, Amy, curious about your thoughts. There's an alderman in his introduced an ordinance that would add cameras to CTA buses that would allow for ticketing, therefore, if there is a car that is blocking, for example, a bus-only lane. What do you make of that? Would things like more cameras help?
Yeah, there's a lot of practices around speeding up buses that include getting cars that are parked in bus lanes out of bus lanes. It's a really important piece of making transit a much more viable option for those of us that ride transit to get around, and for others who could make the choice to ride transit. So it is important to use different tools to allow those buses to speed up, and having cars parked in the bus lane, having cars parked in the bike lane, it not only slows people down, but especially in the bike lane, makes it a lot more unsafe to travel. So there are a lot of different things to do about that. City's working on some of it, but I think with all these solutions, we need to go bigger, bolder, faster to save lives.
David, as the city is looking at all of these initiatives, how do you measure success?
Well, I think we measure success by the quality of life that we create for our residents, and transportation, mobility, accessibility is a huge part of a successful city. So reducing crashes, making our streets safer is a huge part of measuring success, but also creating vibrant, sustainable, healthy, successful communities is really the goal. And if you look around at what we're doing in Chicago, what cities around the world are doing, biking, pedestrian accessibility is a huge part of building successful cities.
Well, thank you very much. No, you didn't have to travel far to be with us, but we nonetheless appreciate your time, and safe travels to you going forward, Amy Reinell and David Smith.
Thanks.
And now back to Paris for a look at what's being done about another road hazard. Paris.
Amanda, unlawful drag racing in Chicago has reached a, quote, fever pitch. That's according to Chicago Police Superintendent David Brown, who said as of yesterday, 9 people have been arrested and 7 cars impounded, and at least 1 pedestrian died as a result of a suspected drag race near Midway. And joining us are Julie Darling, an executive board member with the West Loop Community Organization, Alderman Brian Hopkins of the 2nd Ward on the north side, and Alderman Byron Siccho Lopez of the 25th Ward on the west side. Welcome all of you here for this discussion. Starting with you, Julie Darling, let's take a look at some of the incidents that happened in the West Loop over the weekend. It seems like they've just been growing over the past year or two. It's not a new thing, but it seems to be happening more often now. What are you hearing from your neighbors?
Well, our neighbors are very concerned for obvious reasons. Getting woken up at 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning with what's going on, it's a public safety issue. We have a lot of first responders, nurses, doctors in our neighborhood coming home at all hours of the night. And it's now gotten to the point where the community is in absolute uproar over it.
And Alderman Siccho Lopez, as we mentioned, it's not like this is a new thing, but it seems to have reached a fever pitch, to use Superintendent Brown's phrasing. Why hasn't the city been able to quell this?
Well, we as a council, we introduced and passed, Alderman Hopkins passed an ordinance like last month is being in effect. What we have seen is that this now is affecting almost every ward is across the city and is becoming not only more frequent, but also more violent. I think that one of the concerns that we have is that outside of the, immediate, approach to the ordinance, the impounding and the hefty fees that come with it, I do think that we need a comprehensive approach. My concern is the state of the city on the conditions in our park districts and schools are making this an impossible task. When we see this issue getting worse and worse, and we're not taking preventive action outside of the action that already City Council is taking us, and I think my concern that this is going to just get worse and worse if we don't take preventive action and a comprehensive approach to make sure that young adults and minors have activities in our park districts and schools and beyond. And with the curfew in downtown, we're seeing all these issues getting worse and worse in our neighborhoods without a comprehensive approach that I think what the city needs right now.
Alderman Hopkins, that ordinance which would impound someone's vehicle involved in one of these events and charge them with a $10,000 fine, it's been in effect for a little while now. I remember interviewing you when you introduced it. Do you believe this will be a deterrent?
It already is. We're seeing the impact of it on social media. We monitor the open source channels that the people who engage in these activities rely upon. They all have YouTube channels. This is a very, social media driven phenomena. They want attention. They crave likes and subscribers and followers. So we're watching them respond to news of this ordinance and to the fact that, as you mentioned in the lead into this segment, we've impounded 7 vehicles already. And by the way, that's only beginning. We have plans to impound dozens more in the coming weeks. We think that will have a deterrent effect because the people who do this put a lot of money into those vehicles. It's their prized possession. And the last thing they want is for that thing to be held captive in that den on Lower Wacker Drive where, I think we've all had to go there at some point in our careers as Chicago residents, right? So that's not the place you want a vehicle that you care about to be impounded. And this is a strong deterrent effect that's taking place right now.
Julie Darling, do you believe the police department is doing all that it can to stop these on the scene?
I think that they're doing all that they can with the resources that they've been given. I think that this ordinance is a great first step, but now we need to, it has to be in exponential form. When there's a 911 call placed and there's other urgent matters taking place, there's only so much that they're going to be able to do. So while I agree that this is a great first measure and that more cars will be impounded, it's not going to go away. And I'm with Alderman Lopez on that statement that we need to really get to the root issues of why this is happening. And because somebody's going to get hurt. So whether or not that incident took place was related, all it's going to take is one more situation.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, you're referring to the pedestrian who was killed near Midway in what officials suspect was a drag race, although the defendant there was saying they were trying to escape a carjacking. Alderman Hopkins or Sigcho Lopez, do you know any more about that case?
We have evidence to suggest that the individuals involved were engaged in drifting a little bit earlier in the evening, and the evidence does point to the fact that they were drag racing. They're not admitting that, but the investigation is ongoing, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw those charges eventually.
So if indeed that is the case, then it is already costing lives here. And let's hear what Superintendent Brown had to say about all this.
What the council has started doing as far as looking at ordinances that can hold these people more accountable, primarily taking their cars. We need to do more of that, more amendments to this ordinance to be able to take their cars, and then that would discourage their behaviors. We're working with the aldermen to do some of the spectator enforcement. Some cities have spectator enforcement, violations just as a spectators.
Alderman Sigcho Lopez, what about that? Should there be an ordinance that charges spectators that just sit around and watch this?
Well, I think that the ordinance has been introduced. We need time to see how this ordinance is going to work. I mean, these things take time. My concern, when we start going after everyone and anyone, right, that we have to be careful with the due process, and we have to be careful that this does not become what has become almost an invitation, to get more and bigger crowds to this. So I do think that, in my opinion, when we look at the root causes, as Julie was mentioning, we got to look that these are just immediate deterrence actions that the council is taking. But the root causes of this, you got to look at what's happening in the city. Half of public pools were closed this summer. We got very little programming in our public schools, to none. We have very little activities in our neighborhoods across the board. So when we don't have alternatives that we can provide our young adults and minors, we continue to see these issues growing and growing in frequency, and they're growing again in the confrontations that we see. So again, I do think that we need a comprehensive approach. This is the first step. We need time to see how that works, but I think the root causes is something that we need to acknowledge and start acting on.
Although I should mention, when I reported on this a year ago, a lot of the folks coming in on these motorcycle caravans or three-wheeler caravans were coming from both within and outside of the city, many of them from far away of the city. So Alderman Hopkins, in terms of this onlooker part of the ordinance, how specifically would that work?
Yeah, if you park a vehicle in such a manner as to provide basically what's a stage or a track, they're using vehicles to kind of enforce the borders where the drifting and the donuts take place within it, you're considered a participant in the event. So we do have already, under current law, we have the means to take enforcement action against spectators if they're there participating in the event and serving to create the area where the activity takes place. We're targeting the vehicles who are actually engaged in the drifting and the racing for impoundment. But as we expand our efforts, I know the superintendent said he'd like to see further amendments to the ordinance. I assume he's talking about adding more teeth to it. But I'd like to see us actually use the teeth that they were just given when this ordinance just passed, about a month ago. It's a difficult thing. We've got dozens of cars involved in this, hundreds of spectators with their cars. It's not an easy task to impound hundreds of cars at once. It requires a great mobilization of resources, manpower, tow trucks from the Department of Streets and Sanitation, all of that. So a lot of the planning that's going forward right now is sort of ramping up as we test this out on a smaller scale and eventually get to the point where we potentially could impound dozens of cars at one time. And to your earlier question, Paris, if we do that, that absolutely will have a chilling effect. One of the reasons that so many of the participants came to Chicago last weekend from as far away as California, if we had people here from 14 states, is because the word was out, you can go to Chicago and get away with this. The police seem to be not really taking it seriously. That's changing, and the word needs to get out that that is no longer the case. All right, well, we'll have to continue following this issue, but for now, our thanks to Julie Darling, Alderman Brian Hopkins, and Alderman Byron Sigjo Lopez. Thanks so much. And up next, we show you a colossal collection of rare movie posters, so please stay with us.
Much of the story of Latinos in America is that of entrepreneurship. About 5 million Latino-owned businesses currently exist in the U.S.
Predominantly Latino communities often bear the environmental burden of heavy industry. Residents of those communities say they have a hard time making their concerns heard.
A Chicago-based photographer has a personal understanding of immigration, and he has spent years documenting small businesses.
The forces of gentrification can make people being priced out of their neighborhoods feel powerless. But the founders of Lolita's Bodega say residents have more power than they think.
When your hobby turns into one of the most comprehensive collections of movie posters in the world, what do you do for an encore? A local collector once had 45,000 posters and lobby cards. He sold some, donated others, and kept the cream of the crop. He shared with Chicago Tonight how graphic art and movie history combine in an artful form of advertising. Producer Mark Vitale has the story.
From a gigantic Spanish poster for the Alfred Hitchcock classic North by Northwest, to a rarity that features Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, the prototype for Mickey Mouse, and enough lobby cards to fill the lobbies of 100 movie theaters. It's a collection from the golden age of the silver screen, when colorful movie posters made lasting first impressions.
Back in the day when films first evolved, it was the only form of advertising. This was meant to grab you by the lapels and say, get in this movie theater and see this film.
Dwight Cleveland has had a passion for posters and lobby cards since the 1970s. He has work from 56 countries. His collection was the focus of a book, Cinema on Paper, with an introduction by Ben Mankiewicz of Turner Classic Movies.
I collect differently from most collectors who collect by film genre or particular movie star, director, things like that. I fell in love with the posters first and the artwork, and then I learned to love the movies after that. So everything that I own, I love from an artistic standpoint. It's difficult to define in words. It's more of a visceral reaction that I get when I see something, and I just know that I have to own it. It just speaks out to me and says, you know, take me home.
He began his collection as a teenager with a Gary Cooper lobby card. A high school teacher was also a collector and asked him to hunt down posters on his want list.
In the course of hunting down the things on his want list, I fell in love with all sorts of other posters and just kind of became hooked, and it's been my drug of choice ever since.
He continued collecting through a career renovating historic Chicago homes. He handles movie history with the same care.
I started out as a collector, and then I learned about restoration and archiving and cataloging and kind of all of that stuff. And now I've really transitioned more into advocate in terms of elevating the art form.
Cleveland reduced his cinematic stockpile with donations to the Library of Congress, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and other institutions. His collection is the basis of an exhibition on the role of women in early film history at the Poster House Museum in New York City. His advice to aspiring collectors?
I guess the best advice I can give is just buy what you love. I mean, that's what I've done, and everything has kind of fallen into place.
Now, with his smaller collection, he's eyeing its future.
I would love to see it in an institution that will treat it properly and make it available for film scholars and the general public. And how that happens, you know, I don't know yet, but I'm certainly taking calls on that.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Mark Vitale.
Those posters certainly grabbed me by my lapel. Now, there is more from our interview with collector Dwight Cleveland on our website, where you can also get information about his book, Cinema on Paper. And if you find yourself in New York City, his exhibition, Women in Early Hollywood, is at the Poster House Museum until October 9th. And now, Paris, we toss it back to you.
Reminds me, there's a lot of old movies I need to catch up on, too. All right, thanks, Amanda. Still to come on Chicago Tonight. Starbucks employees in Edgewater say managers are targeting them for discipline because of their support for unionization. Uptown activists who are pushing for more affordable housing camp out in a former hospital parking lot to block a new luxury condo development. And Chicago's lakefront used to be home to Nike missile bases. The history behind these sites and what the old military grounds look like today in Ask Jeffrey. But first, some more of today's top stories. New questions about Governor Pritzker's blind trust and investments in companies doing business with the state. According to a Better Government Association investigation, Pritzker's investment portfolio includes interests in 12 for-profit companies that earned more than $20 billion in state business since he took office. That includes a company called Centene, the parent company of one of the state's main Medicaid providers. The investigation reveals that Pritzker had to know about some of his investments when he filed his economic disclosure statements with the state. But in a response, the Pritzker campaign stated, quote, under the blind trust rules the governor has in place, Illinois voters know as much about the governor's investments as he does. The statement goes on to ridicule the BGA and believes the organization has it wrong. Former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev dies at the age of 91 in Moscow. Gorbachev is known for ending the Cold War without nuclear bloodshed while introducing key political and economic reforms that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. His death was announced by Russia's state news agencies after a, quote, long and grave illness. Illinois reports its first human case and first human death of West Nile virus so far this year. The virus was detected in Cook County in a 70-year-old who became ill earlier this month and later died. Illinois Department of Public Health Director Dr. Samir Vora said in a statement, quote, this unfortunate first reported death of the year from West Nile virus in Illinois is a reminder that this disease poses a risk, especially to those who have weakened immune systems. While the weather's warm and mosquitoes are breeding, we should all take precautions to protect ourselves from mosquitoes and the viruses they carry. And now, Amanda, we go back to you.
Thanks, Paris. Workers at a unionized Starbucks coffee shop in Edgewater walked off the job today, protesting what they say is a pattern of the company illegally disciplining employees as retaliation for organizing. As Chicago Tonight's Nick Blumberg reports, those charges have been echoed by pro-union Starbucks workers around the U.S.
Employees at the Clark and Ridge Starbucks called a one-day unfair labor practice strike Tuesday, the same day the company launched its much-loved line of yearly fall drinks. Worker Emily Alimo says management's attitude has changed dramatically.
We kind of had a culture of like, it's very chill, it's a fun place to work, and so if you're clocking in a couple minutes late here and there, no one's going to get on your back for it. And until the unionization started, and now it's like we have targets on our back.
Alimo says she was just given a final warning. Among her write-ups were for a day when she says she was sick with a stomach bug, but still told to come in and got physically ill on her way to work.
Because of everything, I was 7 minutes late. I punched the clock 7 minutes late. I told my manager, I'm sick, this is what's happening, this is why I'm late. And she said, well, I really still need you to be here so that nobody else is stressed out.
A spokesperson told WTTW News in a statement, Starbucks has great partners and we value their contributions. We respect our partners' right to engage in any legally protected activity or protest without retaliation. We are grateful for each partner who continues to work, and we always do our best to listen to the concerns of all our partners. The Edgewater Starbucks is one of 7 unionized locations in the Chicago area and one of more than 200 around the U.S. So far, none of the unionized coffee shops has a contract. Edgewater worker Chris Triskopoulos is a member of the National Bargaining Committee and says the company won't come to the table.
We've sent out mass letters on behalf of stores across the country now, right? And we haven't heard anything back. And it's frustrating. We want to work in good faith, and they keep saying they want to as well, but we just don't hear back from them.
Employees around the U.S. have accused Starbucks of retaliating against pro-union workers. The National Labor Relations Board has accused the company of an array of violations, including wrongly terminating employees and withholding raises. Emily Alimo says the narrative that pro-union workers are entitled is off the mark.
We are out here working so hard, doing this unpaid work to make things better for everybody, and it's because Starbucks is unwilling to do so.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Nick Blumberg.
Starbucks has consistently denied claims of union busting, calling them categorically false, and saying the company will defend itself against unfair labor practice charges. Up next, why some Uptown residents are protesting a new luxury condo development. But first, a look at the weather.
Affordable housing activists in Uptown have been camped out in a parking lot for more than a week in a bid to block construction of a new luxury condo development. The lot was formerly owned by Weiss Memorial Hospital, but then was sold. It's now owned by Lincoln Property Company, and that company aims to build a 314-unit apartment building on the site. But just 8 of those units will be affordable. And in a community ravaged by homelessness and with an affordable housing crisis, activists are crying foul. And joining us now are Angela Clay, an organizer with Northside Action for Justice. That's a progressive group advocating for economic and social justice. Clay is also running to replace retiring 46th Ward Alderman James Kappelman on the City Council. And Adam Gottlieb, an organizer with the Chicago Union of the Homeless. And we did reach out to developer Lincoln Property Company, but they declined to join us for this conversation, as did Alderman James Kappelman. But we do appreciate the two of you being here. Angela Clay, I'll start with you. So protesters have been camped out in this parking lot. What is it that they're hoping to accomplish?
Yeah, we're hoping to accomplish bringing the voices of the folks in our ward to the seat of power. We have felt like our most neediest neighbors have been ignored. And as a community that is vibrant and diverse, we want to make sure that they feel like this is their home as well, and that they have affordable housing that supports them as well, too.
And Adam Gottlieb, what about this proposal do you find objectionable? Is it that relatively small portion of affordable housing that they're proposing?
It's pretty much everything about it, Paris. Every block in this neighborhood, practically, they have new high-cost apartments and condos going up. And rents are skyrocketing, and people are getting pushed out of their homes by rising rents. Meanwhile, people have been getting pushed back and forth across these parks and viaducts for years who are living in tents and experiencing homelessness. And we're saying enough is enough. Uptown residents and Chicagoans all over deserve to stay in their homes, deserve community control over the places where they live, and access to affordable housing and health care.
Angela Clay, at the same time, this was a parking lot, so it's not as if the company's tearing down an existing building that people lived in and displacing them. So is it kind of apples and oranges here?
Well, it's not. And the reason why we say that is this is actually an expansion space. So it has been used for a multitude of purposes. At the height of the pandemic, it was actually used to screen for COVID-19 testing in a way that kept the entirety of the hospital safe, right? Because it was outdoors. It had access on and off to Lakeshore Drive, so people could just drive up. So it's not just a parking lot. It's an expansion space that can really be turned into a multitude of things to serve the needs of our communities on a healthcare basis or as a communal basis. So we don't see it as a parking lot. We see it as an expansion space for the community.
Adam Gottlieb, as we mentioned, we invited Lincoln Property to come on the show. They're not here. But if you were sitting across from them or sitting across from them on Zoom, what would you tell them about what you'd like them to do with this?
We'd like them to immediately sell the lot back to resilience or work with the city to turn this land into something in the interest of the whole community. As Angela just said, it could be used for any number of expanded healthcare services, drop-in centers, harm reduction center, or affordable housing. But we want them to immediately stop this harmful project. And we think housing is for people who need houses, not for rich people to make a profit off of.
Angela Clay, what about the company promising to increase affordable housing? Say they did that. Would that win support?
It's a conversation, right? Because I don't speak solely from my own personal view. We have been doing this as a community for over 2 years now. So it would have to be a discussion that felt equitable for all of us who have been on the front lines fighting for this for the past 2 years. It's not just something as simple as saying, look, we'll throw you 4 more affordable units. Is that okay? No, this is talking about the ecosystem of our ward right now. Everywhere you look, like Adam mentioned, there is unaffordable housing going up. And we're talking about the longevity here. We're a ward that is primarily CPS teachers. We're a ward of families, right? So the housing stock that we're building is not suitable for families to stay here and raise their families here. So affordability absolutely would be a point that we would push, but it's also about the stock and the longevity of the housing as well.
Adam Gottlieb, you kind of got into a little bit of this, but how acute is the problem of affordability and homelessness specifically in Uptown?
Oh, we're in a crisis here, and in Uptown it's more visible than almost anywhere else on the north side of Chicago, although you can see tent encampments popping up all over Chicago. But the tents have been increasing for the last 2 to 3 years during the pandemic and the housing crisis that has been in the fallout of the pandemic. We're surrounded by one of the largest homeless communities in the city of Chicago right now, and a lot of our leadership in this coalition is coming from folks who have that lived experience or are currently experiencing homelessness. And we say housing is a human right, so we won't go without a fight.
Angela Clay, the current Alderman Kappelman, is retiring. You're one of several folks announcing their intentions to run. Have you been able to talk to the Alderman about this issue, and where does he stand on it?
Yeah, so we've tried to have conversations with our outgoing aldermen. Unfortunately, they've been ignored. They've been looked at as, non-viable voices. And that's a slap in the face to our multiracial coalition that we've really been able to build here. We are a coalition of folks who've been displaced by rising rents in our community. We've been at the forefront making sure that we have mental health resources in conjunction with our community hospitals like Weiss. And he's basically taken a stance that this is a great adjustment and an addition to our ward. And look, this isn't a conversation about if we want development. Development is something that we can agree that our ward needs, but it has to be in an equitable fashion that suits the needs of all of our neighbors, no matter their income. So we've tried to have conversations civically, and they've unfortunately gone ignored.
All right, well, hopefully we can hear from the developer at some point soon, and we'll keep following this. But for now, our thanks to Angela Clay and Adam Gottlieb. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And up next, Chicago was once home to nearly 24 Nike missile bases. What the sites look like today in an encore edition of Ask Jeffrey. So please stay with us.
Ask Jeffrey is brought to you in part by BMO Harris Bank.
Okay. Can you get this? I don't have my wallet. Oh, really? It's funny how that always happens. Yeah, it's funny.
With BMO Harris, you don't need your wallet. You can get money from any BMO ATM using your phone.
Uh-oh, looks like someone can buy their own tacos. Okay.
You could also pay them back with Zelle.
So many ways for you to pay. You know what? I'm not hungry. I'll just have some of yours.
Order for BMO.
Ooh, tacos, banking. Some things are made to be mobile.
That feeling you get when your phone is your wallet. That's the BMO effect.
The Russian invasion of Ukraine may bring back memories of the Cold War. As the U.S. and other countries enact sanctions against Russia for invading Ukraine, a viewer sent us a question about remnants of escalating tensions between the U.S. and the USSR. We dig into that and more in our latest installment of Ask Jeffrey. Jeffrey, welcome back to the studio. We're glad you're here.
Great to be here.
So let's get to that question. It's from John Reese of Chicago, who asks, were intercontinental ballistic missiles ever housed or siloed at Montrose Harbor? If so, are any of the silo structures still there?
Well, our questioner is on the right track. There were no ICBMs or intercontinental ballistic missiles at Montrose Harbor, but there was a Nike missile base there, right there at Montrose Harbor. Nike missiles were defensive weapons. They were the country's first surface-to-air guided missile system, whereas ICBMs were offensive weapons. They were actually what led to Nike missiles becoming obsolete. The U.S. developed the Nike missiles during the Cold War to defend against a new generation of Soviet bombers that were armed with nuclear weapons capable of reaching almost any target in the entire United States.
Wow. So how many of these sites were there around the country?
Well, across the country, there were about 300 Nike missile sites. They were installed in rings around major metropolitan areas and other strategic sites around the country. This was in the early 1950s. In the Chicago area, there were about 20 of them. Montrose Harbor was the radar and command center that controlled a battery of missiles actually located right next door at Belmont Harbor. Another launch facility, it's hard to picture this now, was on the south side in Jackson Park with radar and control right there on Promontory Point. There were also Chicago area sites at Wolf Lake, Fort Sheridan, the Skokie Lagoons, and elsewhere. And these were placed strategically to overlap so that no part of the area would be left unprotected. I actually grew up not far from the Skokie Lagoons, and I'm old enough to remember as a little kid actually seeing the missiles there right in the Skokie Lagoons from time to time. This would be as we drove by on the Edens Expressway. Initially, the United States used Nike Ajax missiles, but the Ajax could only travel about 25 miles, and military leaders felt that was just not far enough to be an effective air defense. The Nike Hercules was Ajax's successor, which could travel up to 90 miles. And the first Nike Hercules in Chicago was at that Belmont Harbor site. The missiles, along with the fuel and waste products, were stored in these sort of large underground kind of basements, big vaults, sometimes many stories deep. And then a large elevator would bring the missiles up to the surface, and the crew members would push the missiles into position. Now, no missiles were actually ever launched in Chicago, but the missile crews would practice bringing them up from underground and pointing them up at the sky, and that's what, as a little kid, you know, we could see from the Edens Expressway right there in the Skokie Lagoons.
Wow. So you also mentioned the intercontinental ballistic missiles led to the end of Nike. How so?
Yes. So Nike was meant to defend against manned aircraft. But by the late 1950s, the Soviet Union shifted shifted its strategy basically because these aircraft were vulnerable to attacks from the Nike missiles. The solution was intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. That was at the origin of this question, and those could actually be launched from Soviet soil. So this change eventually made Nike's air defense role obsolete, and U.S. defense dollars were shifted to developing America's own intercontinental ballistic missiles, as well as missile defense systems, and of course also at that time the growing war in Vietnam. The U.S. government began phasing out Nike bases in the mid-1960s amid budget cuts, and fully deactivated most of the sites after the Second Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty was signed by the Soviet Union and the U.S. in 1974. And by the way, the U.S. still has an arms limitation treaty with Russia that runs through 2026.
Okay, so did the U.S. install any sites for intercontinental ballistic missiles in the Chicago area?
No, never had that. There was a proposal to install anti-ballistic missiles in suburban Vernon Hills. These would be designed to shoot down incoming ICBMs as part of the national, it was called the Sentinel program. So it's kind of a different defensive weapon than the Nike missiles. But that plan faced a lot of criticism and pushback, both locally and across the country, by public officials and scientists. They were concerned about the missile's margin of error and its proximity to major cities. Together, the factors could have led to a catastrophic impact if an accident were to occur. There was actually a lawsuit, but before that came to trial, President Nixon announced that the missile program would be scrapped, and so no missiles were ever installed around major cities.
So are there any remnants of the Nike sites still standing?
Well, almost all of these towers and control facilities are gone now, including all traces at Montrose Harbor, to our viewer's question. But some remnants and buildings still stand, including in Wolf Lake, where there is an actual Nike missile on display. Promontory Point's old site is now part of the Lakefront Trail, and Belmont Harbor, same thing. Became kind of a large grassy area. But it should be said that in 1971, before the U.S. government gave up ownership of that site, a few dozen indigenous people occupied it, demanding the government turn the area into public housing and a school for their community. Eventually, they were forcibly removed from Belmont Harbor, and they went on to occupy other former military grounds.
Now, you know, it's nearly 5 decades after the last Nike site closed. Since then, Russia has invaded Ukraine. Can we draw any lessons by recalling that era of Nike missiles in the Cold War arms race?
Well, for one thing that I remember, it was very, very expensive, and for that and other reasons, the two Cold War superpowers stepped back from the brink, signing that SALT treaty that I mentioned earlier, aimed at limiting production of nuclear-tipped missiles, and of course the Soviet Union eventually collapsed. I guess all I can say is we can only hope that the world has learned from history as events unfold in Ukraine today.
Yeah, certainly devastating what's happening there. And Jeffrey Baer, good to see you in the studio, always learning something.
Glad to be here.
And don't forget that you can visit our website to submit your own question to Jeffrey Baer. That's at WTTW.com/AskJeffrey. And we're back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabee family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
That's our show for this Tuesday night. Please join us tomorrow night live at 7 with another alderman headed for the exit. Is there an aldermanic exodus at City Hall? Our Spotlight Politics team weighs in.
Plus, tuition across the country has tripled in the last 40 years. We discuss the impact across the state. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Amanda Vinicky.
And I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you so much for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a great evening.